I recently had the pleasure of meeting the founder of a new force in British politics, the I'm Not a Moron party. He was kind enough to give me a copy of his manifesto. I was indiscreet enough to type it all up and share it with everyone. After all, exposing a thing to the fabled marketplace of ideas is the best way to test its merit, unless of course it's a form of feminism that has the temerity to address real women, in which case punch it. As compelling as I personally find this manifesto, I cannot vouch for the mental stability of its author, Lord Humphrey Wotham-Botham Jenkins. I met him at what he claimed was his ancestral home, a country house in Wiltshire. The National Trust charges £14.99 for entry. The staff advised me not to approach Lord Jenkins on account of his last misdemeanour. He had apparently positioned himself on the east wing roof in order to shoot at peasants. In court he represented himself with a rambling speech about the injustice of 1099 and the evils of marmalade. Nevertheless, I found him to be a congenial chap, and was most taken with his political ideas. He inducted me into his party by way of whisky, and promised me a cabinet position if he were ever successful. What follows is Lord Wotham-Botham's manifesto. It begins with a declaration. I, Lord Humphrey Wotham-Botham Jenkins, third of that name, know what it means to be dispossessed. Some say I squandered my inheritance on whores, heroin, and Quinn dynasty porcelain. Others, my lawyer for instance, couldn't possibly comment. Whatever the cause of my destitution, I was recently forced into selling my beloved Winthrop Manor to the National Trust, whose odious little foot soldiers have confined me to a measly 9 rooms in the East Wing. Thus imprisoned, I have developed a keen sense for what Britain at large must be feeling. For it seems to me that the British, and in particular the English, have been dispossessed of their Anglican God-given right to live in peace and liberty. What is peace, I ask you? It is the sight of one's peacocks mating on a bright June day, a terrific spectacle, as the males are ravenously polygamous. What is liberty? It is the freedom to drive one's Bentley at 60 miles per hour through the village of Little Strumpet, with its charming primary school and zebra crossings. Neither of our two main parties give a fig for these blessings of English liberty. The Labour Party has abandoned the working classes, upon whom I relied to garden 50 acres of fine Jenkins estate. I had to resort to paying Romanians to do it instead. They did it for £3 an hour. Poor British people did it for £5 an hour. I was therefore deprived of an opportunity to practice noblesse oblige. As for the Conservatives, I cannot even think of them without a strong desire to commit what the Japs call harikiri. In fact, I did try this once, with a letter opener. Now I wear a colostomy bag. I am a walking symbol of the damage those loons have done to our great country. I note with despair that a sizable chunk of MPs remain loyal to Boris Johnson. Let me tell you about Boris Johnson, who once came to visit me, he and his 7th wife. Halfway through luncheon, Mr. Johnson asked for the lavatory. "Which one?" I said. "The nearest," he said. So I gave him directions, and nearly 30 minutes later he returned looking red in the face. He went home at 5 o'clock. 2 days later I was strolling past my absolutely favourite porcelain jug when a terrible thing happened, and I fell to my knees retching. The fat blonde bastard had relieved himself in £6,000 worth of priceless antique. So I called him up and told him as much. Of course he denied it. I called him some pretty salty things. He told me I was a paranoid has-been codger with letters for brains. That hurt. Anyway, the culprit turned out to be a disgruntled Romanian, but that's beside the point. It seemed just the sort of thing Boris would do, and I suspect the British public would agree with me. Which is why I have written this manifesto. I have in my 74 years on this earth been accused of many things: fraud, tax evasion, libel, speeding, driving without a licence, contempt of court, public indecency, but I have never been accused of being a moron. With that in mind, I decided to call my party the I'm Not a Moron party, because its policies could only be quibbled with by morons. Defence. NATO was invented for the Cold War. The Cold War is over, ergo we must leave NATO at once. Membership only perpetuates our servitude to America, with whom we enjoy a relationship not unlike that of a hog-tied German businessman in the midst of a raucous pegging by a Dutch prostitute. In its place I propose the reintroduction of national service. Taxation. Taxes are a legal form of theft by which the useless steal money from the useful to spend uselessly. Now, as it happens, I rather like money, so I shouldn't abolish taxes outright, but I would certainly ensure that inheritance tax was on the chopping board. Crime and punishment. Rapists, murderers and pedophiles, not to mention murderous raping pedophiles, will be hanged. This should be done in public. The murderers should be hanged at the Tower of London to give the beefeaters something to look at during their lunch breaks. Rapists should be hanged outside Scotland Yard so as to remind them that they're not invincible. Pedophiles should be hanged outside the BBC for the same reason. Energy. I am well acquainted with energy. I seem to have so much of it until, slumped over my mistress in bed, it's all gone. As such, I would issue a national order for the utilisation of domestic hamsters. There are 600,000 of these rodents in Britain. If we put them all on hamster wheels hooked up to the national grid, we could generate 300,000 watts per year. Of course, this would be supplemented by nuclear power stations and shale and whatever can be harnessed from the bloviations of Labour's front bench. Immigration. I am given to understand that this is a rather touchy subject. I once knew an MP who raised concerns about it back in the early 2000s. He was accused of being a racist so many times that I shouldn't be surprised if he actually became one, a case of the imagination constructing reality, you know. I never saw him again, but I heard it through the grapevine that he was gored to death by a cassowary in Papua New Guinea. What he was doing there I don't know. I myself have little experience of immigration, besides my Romanian gardeners, because I am very rich and live behind a big fence. I suppose it would be wise to limit net migration to the low thousands, or else halt it entirely for a period. For the sake of social harmony, you see. When one looks at France, I try not to as a general rule, one sees quite clearly the dangers of importing vast numbers of disaffected young men with nothing much to do. I'm sure many of them are salutary young chaps at an individual level, but angry young men, be they black, brown, white or yellow, are a devil to deal with en masse. It seems to me only fair that if the Third World is to allow to come here, then the First World ought to be able to go there and rebuild all those roads and hospitals and democratic institutions we left behind. But what I will say is that if we are to take such an interest in whom to import, equal care should be taken about whom to export. I suggest we export Chihuahua dogs, Swiss cheese and Liberal Democrats. Someone out there must want these things, I don't. Environment. The environment is what you see when you open your eyes. Architecture is therefore a part of it. Now let me say very clearly that any architect or town council complicit in the use of concrete will be executed. All this nonsense about net zero is designed to placate hedge fund managers, Swedish truants and unhappily married middle-class power walkers. When the National Trust put a solar panel on the West Wing, I had an aneurysm. That brings me to the NHS. Healthcare. I have never used the NHS, but the NHS has most certainly used me. I am an inveterate smoker, and cigarettes are heavily taxed. Now, I may be a wastrel, or so at least according to father, but as a scion of one of Britain's oldest families, I have a duty to care for those beneath me. Thus, I would not contemplate abolishing our National Health Service, but I can think of a few improvements. The first is to prioritise fat people. Fat people represent the good life in the flesh, lots of flesh. If eating and drinking one's way to an early grave is considered shameful, then may the whole country be saturated in shame. It would, if nothing else, be an up yours to the Puritans in our midst. The second is to sack anyone who isn't a doctor, nurse, surgeon, or essential keyboard clacker. The third is... well, I forget the third, but the fourth is to increase funding for dementia patients. Scottish Referendum. I have been to Scotland once. I was 17. I got drunk in Glasgow with some cronies and woke up in a ditch with a sore bottom. The Romans were wise to abandon it, and so would we be, but not before reintroducing wolves to the Highlands. Transport. The problem with transport in Britain is that there are lots of ports but very little transiting. Take buses, for instance. I was once required to get on a bus because I went on a bender in Soho, and when consciousness returned, I was not in Soho but Northampton. I'd heard of Southampton, and of course Hampton Court Palace, but never Northampton. God had forsaken it. I boarded a series of buses that eventually dropped me off within the general vicinity of Winthrop Manor. It took 2 days. One of the drivers passed out at a T-junction. Moreover, I recall a fight between 2 passengers over the legal proprietorship of a phone repair shop in Bangladesh, or so I gathered. The point is that no one gets a bus unless they can absolutely help it. So I suppose I would improve buses somehow, and trains too. Education. It's been said that a little learning is a dangerous thing. I've often taken this to imply that a lot of learning would be a really dangerous thing. It is therefore difficult to know just how much we should be teaching the young, but of course I have my notions. I cannot, for example, understand why we are teaching children how many wives Muhammad had and how many heads that Hindu elephant had. The correct number of wives is one at a time, and elephants have only one head. As for physical education, my own PE teacher took an avid interest in the development of my gluteal muscles. I myself found this most encouraging, and so I hereby appoint Mr. Keith Deepley as my Minister for Physical Education. Welfare. Here I speak with authority. I take, or took before the National Trust ruined my life, a great interest in the welfare of my estate. There are horses to brush, and chickens to feed, and plants to water, and such like. Of course, I don't myself actually do any of these things, but I make damn well sure that someone does. Then there was that time back in the 80s when I found a homeless man slumped against the orangery like some hideous changeling. I hosed him down in the stables and fed him some oats. It turned out to be my Uncle Toby, who had disgraced himself at Christmas '71, another story entirely. The point is that I care for the down and out, and when I am Prime Minister, everyone will be eligible for universal credit, provided they use a portion of it to support England's nascent viticulture. The Church of England. I am fortunate to have a private chapel in which to confess my sins and listen to the word of God. Up and down the country, however, this must be done in churches presided over by heretical priests and bishops who wouldn't know the gospel if it landed on them. I would immediately reinstitute the King James Version and the 1662 Book of Common Prayer. Any bishop who goes above their station as a simple pen-pusher will be paraded through the streets of North London, where all the Republicans live, and at synods they will be limited to a ration of 10 words each. Fox hunting. It may surprise you to learn that in spite of my station in life, I am no great admirer of fox hunting. The only reason I would make it legal again is to shaft Tony Blair. But legalisation will come with a caveat. Once a year the hunters shall become the hunted. Thus, while my cousin Watkins is galloping after his vulpes, he himself will be pursued by lions, tigers and bears. These we could procure via a trade agreement with Texas to dismantle their remaining tiger kings. We could even invite children to witness the spectacle and tell them Wiltshire is in fact Narnia. At this point, Lord Wotham-Botham's manifesto breaks off. This for the perfectly reasonable reason that Lord Wotham-Botham is dead. How exactly he entered into that blessed state remains unknown to me. I've heard different stories. Some say he killed himself. Others say he disappeared to fulfill his lifelong dream of observing the mating habits of the Patagonian condor, and at some point in the expedition must have been killed by the Patagonian puma. Either way, I feel as though we have lost the Prime Minister we deserved, and am honoured to have been able to share with you, dear viewers, his political legacy.